Sometimes you recognize a tool only after it starts working for you. And sometimes it turns out the smallest of tools can help us to sort through the largest of feelings. I learned this a couple of years ago when I mail-ordered myself some knitting needles without quite realizing what I needed them for. This was during the first fraught weeks of the pandemic, and I was in our house in Washington, D.C. I'd been online shopping in a scattershot way, laying in things like board games and art supplies on top of food and toilet paper, unsure of how anything would go, fully and sheepishly aware that impulse shopping is a classic American response to uncertainty. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that in what felt like an instant, we'd gone from normal life to a full-scale global emergency. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that hundreds of millions of people were suddenly and seriously in harm's way, and that the safest, most helpful thing the rest of us could do at the time was to sit quietly at home. Day after day, I stared at the news, struck by the acute unfairness of our world. It was embedded in the headlines, in the job losses, in the death counts, and in the neighborhoods where ambulances screamed loudest. I read articles about hospital workers who were scared to go home after their shifts, afraid they might infect their own families. I saw images of morgue trucks parked on city streets, concert venues being converted into field hospitals. We knew so little and feared so much. Everything felt big. Everything felt consequential. Everything was big. Everything was consequential. It was hard not to feel overwhelmed. I spent the first few days checking in by phone with friends and making sure that my mother, now in her 80s and living alone in Chicago, had a safe way to get groceries. Our daughters arrived home from college, both of them shaken by what was happening and a little reluctant to leave their friends. I hugged them both tight and assured them that this was all temporary, that before long they'd be back to going to loud parties, fretting about a sociology exam, and eating ramen in dorm rooms. I said it in order to help myself believe it. I said it because I know that's part of the job of being a parent, to project an extra smidge of certainty, even as your own knees are buckling a little bit beneath you, even as you are privately anxious about far bigger things than returning your kids to their friends. Even when worried, you say your best hopes out loud. As time went by, our family settled into a quiet routine, anchored by longer than usual dinners in the evenings. We'd process the news, comparing notes on what we'd heard or read, the day's somber statistics, or the unnervingly erratic messaging coming out of the White House, our former home. We tried out the board games I'd bought, did a few puzzles, and watched movies on the couch. Anytime we found something to laugh about, we laughed, because otherwise it all felt too scary. Sasha and Malia continued their schoolwork online. Barack was busy writing his presidential memoirs and increasingly focused on the fact that American voters would soon be deciding whether Donald Trump should stay or go. I, meanwhile, put my energy toward an initiative I'd helped start in 2018 called When We All Vote, meant to empower voters and increase turnout at the polls. At the request of our mayor, I took part in a public service campaign pointedly named Stay Home DC, urging city residents to shelter in place and get tested if they felt ill. I recorded encouraging messages to be passed on to exhausted emergency room workers. And in an effort to ease some tiny part of the burden I knew many parents were carrying, I launched a weekly video series in which I read storybooks out loud for kids. It hardly felt like enough. It surely wasn't enough. This was a reality I think many of us were sitting with at the time. Nothing felt even remotely like enough. There were just too many holes to fill. Next to the enormity of the pandemic, every effort felt small. Trust me, I have no illusions about my own relative luck and privilege in this situation. I understand that being forced to sit largely on the sidelines of a devastating worldwide emergency is no sort of hardship, especially compared to what so many others went through during this time. My family did exactly what lots of us had been instructed to do in the name of safety for all. We battened down inside a wrecking storm.